Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bob Herbst, and I am co-chair of the board of ICAHD USA, which is the North American affiliate of the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions. We, along with our affiliates in the United Kingdom, Germany, and Finland, have been a voice against Israeli policies and practices of home demolitions, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and settler colonialism. We provide a ready source of reliable information on what's going on in the ground in Israel and Palestine. And we are very pleased today to welcome the Reverend Brian Brown. I consider him an authentic hero in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And as his recent book, Apartheid South Africa, Apartheid Israel, illustrates, he is also a clear-eyed student and scholar of what many are coming to assert with increasing vigor is an apartheid regime in Israel-Palestine. Before we get started, let me just remind you all to please stay muted during our conversation and put your questions in the chat so we can keep an eye out for them and incorporate them in the discussion, especially in the last 30 to 45 minutes today. And if you can keep your comments other than questions in the chat to a minimum, that will help us pick up the questions more quickly. We're recording this discussion and will be available on the ICAHD website and YouTube channel for future reference. Brian, welcome.
Thank you.
I just want to say that the book is beautifully written. It's written in love for all the parties involved and in the hope that peace, justice, and equality will triumph over the application of raw power and over tribalism wherever it rears its ugly head. It's also a cry from the heart for the international religious communities, and particularly the Christian churches, along with the rest of the international community, to support the people of Palestine, including with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, as the international community and its churches finally did in South Africa many decades after the Afrikaner oppression of non-whites was made obvious for all to see. So I'd like to start, I think, with how apartheid came to be in South Africa and what its essential attributes were. Because, it ended, I guess, about 30 years ago in 1994. And, I thought I was familiar, had a fair amount of knowledge on the subject, but I will admit that I was not aware of some of the remarkable similarities with what Palestinians face today until I read your book. So can you tell us a little bit of the history and how apartheid came to be established in South Africa?
Surely, Bob. And thank you for your gracious invitation and introduction. And the question as to how it all came to be in South Africa for an apartheid society given to domination, dispossession, and discrimination came about. Well, in 1652, a Dutch navigator, Jan van Riebeeck, landed at the Cape, and thus the white history book told us in South Africa, South Africa was discovered. In fact, the indigenous people had been there for many centuries and had discovered the southern tip of Africa for themselves. But the establishment of settlements in South Africa from European settlers went back to 1652. I think there are two factors which contributed to those white settlements ending as pro-apartheid policy in their political understanding. The one factor is bound up with British imperialism. The Dutch settlers, French as well for a time, found that they were constantly belittled and worse by the British colonialists and empire builders. And the hostility between white speaking and white Dutch speaking culminated in the Anglo-Boer War. And those wars left the Boers, as the white Afrikaners were called, with bitter memories of British rule. In the course of Britain winning the Anglo-Boer Wars, they established concentration camps. And this was long before a guy called Adolf Hitler had come on the scene. And the concentration camps contributed to the death, to illness of thousands of women and children of the Afrikaner people. The other factor which contributed to apartheid was the fact that the Boer people saw themselves as elected by God for a distinctive purpose of evangelizing and Christianizing a continent. They saw themselves as exceptional, as a superior ethnic group, as entitled, and these factors of ethnic superiority, entitlement, exceptionalism, all enabled them to see that the Black people inhabiting the country were inferior in their estimate. A war ensued as between Black tribes and white Boers, and the crucial battle waged took place in the 1830s, just 100 years before I was born. And the Boers, who were numerically fewer, did glory in a very successful campaign come war, whereby the superior numbers of the, in this instance, Zulu tribal people were defeated. And whereas some of us would attribute the victory to gunpowder, the Boers, with their understanding of election and exceptionalism and ethnic superiority, attributed the victory to God. And right through my lifetime in South Africa, which went on until I attained the age of 40 and went into exile, the Battle of Blood River was celebrated as a Covenant Day in South Africa, celebrated by whites, I have to add, and it commemorated God's distinctive victory in that the Lord fought for the Boers. So here you've got two aspects contributing to apartheid. On one level, a Boer remembrance, Afrikaner white remembrance, that having been humiliated by Britain, they would never be humiliated in that way again. Their destiny lay in their hands, and it would be self-determination for them to the detriment of the other tribes and to the supremacy being assured of the Boer nation. And the second factor was that God was involved in all of this. God was there fighting for them. And as this discussion is looking at the equation, if you like, of apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel, the listeners are probably aware at this point that these factors were not unknown in the Israeli conquest of the Palestinian people in recent times. There was the supposed belief that the Jewish Zionists were entering a land without people for a people without land. As the Boers suggested, they were the discoverers and the real inhabitants of South Africa and not the indigenous people. Secondly, they had suffered grievously in concentration camps, and that scenario would never be repeated, as they assumed their destiny to be in their hands, albeit to the detriment of all others. And thirdly, there was this factor that if people found things immoral, these things ceased to be unjust or immoral if God did them, because God is God, isn't he? These were some of the factors that contributed to the similarities that are apparent. On a personal level, there were three things I could mention, but let's wait there.
Okay, well, one of the things that you say in the book, which sort of flows from what you've already said, is that the Afrikaners saw themselves as God's chosen people.
Very much so.
And
the aspect of a divine destiny is very, very apparent if you lived in South Africa. There are passages, and I sense that it's an imperative to say these passages have contradictory passages in the Hebrew scriptures, but there are passages which suggest that God wished to destroy the inhabiting tribes of a promised land, and that God, say, fought against the Amalekites and destroyed them and demanded the entirety of their destruction, genocide. Well, that is your belief coming out of scripture, and you are an ardent Calvinist of Boer persuasion. Then you can see and did see the black people as Amalekites, those who were not elected, not like us, and thus disposable.
yeah, and one interesting thing you mentioned is that in the 1960s, the Prime Minister of South Africa, Mr. Verwoerd, was saying, "We settled a country that was bare."
Yes.
Yeah, it's really, the similarities are remarkable. Now, the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910,
Right.
and the land dispossession started 2 years later, I guess, or was aggravated 2 years later with the Native Land Act, which laid the foundations of apartheid, you say, and then in 1948 is when the apartheid government was actually elected, which is another interesting year, it's good in terms of the Israeli experience. But there was also this role of Namibia. And South Africa apparently had a mandate from the League of Nations to bring that neighboring territory to independence, but South Africa reneged on that mandate and incorporated it de facto, I guess, into South Africa in violation of UN resolution. And then what happened thereafter with Namibia?
Well, I mean, let's just expand a bit on those two aspects, Bob and friends. You
It's
talked
Dr.
about
So 3453 is going to do hospice.
Please.
So they were hoping that her.
Okay, good.
there was the aspect in 1910 of the establishment of the Union of South Africa. But that state was established as a purely white state. The black population at the time would have comprised 80% plus of the total, and yet Britain and its imperialist allies in 1910 quite happily bequeathed to a white-only community a nation which was then devoid of any black enfranchisement or voting presence. So thus did imperialism bequeath to South Africa an enduring problem. The second factor you mentioned came about with, in 1948, the apartheid state being born, synonymous with names like Dr. Malan and, as you've already mentioned, Hendrik Verwoerd. And these, the architects of apartheid, were determined that the neighboring state to which you referred, of Southwest Africa, or Namibia as it became, that mandate, which was South Africa's to bring Namibia to independence, that was never fulfilled. And South Africa occupied Namibia in violation of UN Security Council Resolution 435, put its armed forces into Namibia and purported in a damnable lie to be securing the borders of South Africa against hostile black invasion, whereas the boys who were on the border were not on South Africa's border. They were on the border of Namibia and Angola to the north of South Africa, and they were in decided violation of international law, whereby they refused to allow for Namibia, which was an essentially black country, to be independent. And so again, you have aspects of remarkable similarity between the apartheid state of Israel and South Africa. In this instance, the aspect of illegal occupation, with the suggestion that Namibia was part of South Africa and was to be incorporated into South Africa in violation of law. And I well remember a Namibian rugby player playing for South Africa, and if anybody dared to say, but he is Namibian and not South African, he would be, if in white company, laughed out of court. I just intrude my own personal experience here that the United Nations Commissioner for Namibia, Carlson Swede by name, appointed to bring Namibia to independence, he invited me to visit Windhoek, the capital, and view things for myself. I was also invited by the Council of Churches. On arrival, I was imprisoned and told that I would be deported in due course. And so suddenly I saw something of occupation from the perspective of the occupied. And if you're wanting to discover the nature of oppression, there's nothing like identifying with the oppressed. And in that moment of identification, I realized how apartheid was not only prevalent in my birthplace, South Africa, whereby 4/5 of the population was disenfranchised, dispossessed, and discriminated against. But we exported apartheid into neighboring territories, claiming them for our own. And so similarities, as you suggested, Bob, in your reading of the book, abound.
Yeah. And ultimately, the whites claimed, you say, about 87% of the land for 20% of the population.
Now, that's a very telling figure that you mentioned, because the architect of apartheid, whom I named as Verwoerd, he, of course, sought to suggest that we were segregated but equal. Segregated, black and white, we were. Equality, we did not enjoy.
Yes,
In terms of land, 87% of the land was for whites only, and that was less than 20% of the population. 13% of the land was for blacks only, but the 13% would be divided up into 10 tribal homelands. Some of you with long enough memories and years will know Ciskei, Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, KwaZulu, etc. And these Bantustans, or tribal homelands, were not part of South Africa. They were independent states, albeit not recognized by a single state, save, strangely enough, Israel recognizing Bophuthatswana, a Bantustan state. And in their non-recognition, they were a bastard people, a people without a homeland, a nation, or a vote that was legitimate. And again, you see the similarities both of land dispossession, as for Palestinians being dispossessed in the land of which they were and are indigenous people. And you also see the aspect whereby nationality was dispossessed. No black was the national of a recognized state under apartheid. Under Israeli apartheid, between the Jordan River and in the west, the Mediterranean Sea, there is not a single Palestinian, be he, she, in Israel or in the occupied Palestinian territory, who can vote as the national of an internationally recognized state. Either they vote for the bastard citizenship at the present of the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, and they're not given that opportunity very often these days, I have to say with sadness, or they vote as Arab Israeli in what is, according to the nation-state law of Israel, a basic law enacted about 5 years ago. They vote not as nationals of Israel, but they vote as second-class citizens because the nation of Israel is a nation for Jews and for Jews alone, and Arab Israeli or Palestinians in Israel are not Jews, are not nationals, are not voting with a legitimacy which is conferred solely to their Jewish neighbors.
So I got two questions, and there's one question about the that I want to in the chat I want to get to also, but these Bantustans, which were independent states, to what extent were they controlled by the South African government, and to what extent did they have attributes of independence?
Yeah. The state, say, of Transkei, which was a very big state and one of the first to be given pseudo-independence, they were totally controlled, the Bantustan, by the South African white apartheid regime. For instance, if the black woman who graciously helped us in our home as a domestic, and some viewers might say, was it acceptable for you to have a domestic? It might not have been, but I come clean. We did have a black woman who stayed with us. She was not entitled to be where she resided because she didn't have a pass. She didn't have a permit to be in white South Africa. If then a past raid occurred, and I could tell stories about that, but I won't do it, and Johanna Magoma was found to be this black woman without a pass, the white apartheid state sent her back to her homeland. She might have left her homeland as a child to live illegally in white South Africa. Certainly, the receiving homeland had no right to say, the black authorities supposedly in charge, you can't live here in a Bantustan, had no right to decline to have her returned, even if she had never been there, to a Bantustan. And so the South African facade was very similar in its apartheid rulings to the Israeli facade, whereby the occupied Palestinian territories are given an independence like the Palestinian Authority, or given a pseudo-independence in Gaza, like the blockaded Gaza of Hamas, and yet the ultimate authority and control is of the apartheid Jewish state, the vassal authority, doing the policing in some measure, security in some measure, on behalf of Israel, is the body like the Palestinian Authority. And so, just as the leaders of the Bantustan were vilified as puppets, as surrogate leaders, as sellouts and quislings, so the same phenomenon is understandable in the developing Palestine of today.
So Martha Banks has a question. The early history of South Africa is reminiscent of the doctrine of discovery in the Americas. How much impact did the early 20th century US eugenics movement have on South Africa's apartheid?
One of the pillars is the need of the oppressed population. Unlike.
You want me to try that again?
Yeah, and can you just lift your pace a bit
Pardon?
for me to see? Yeah.
The early history of South Africa is reminiscent of the doctrine of discovery in the Americas. How much impact did the early 20th century US eugenics movement have on South Africa's apartheid?
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of a master people looking down upon an inferior indigenous people, which was very true of apartheid South Africa, was not, of course, unique to South Africa. The whole thing of racism is internationally prevalent. And if South Africa under apartheid, my white people are damned in a way that is distinctive, it is perhaps because they were, in a way, commendably honest and forthright in declaring that theirs was a racism which could be legislated for, and they weren't into catch a monkey, steely, careful, talk not. In other words, they weren't into a situation of dispossessing an indigenous people, as happened, say, in your Americas, in Australia, in New Zealand, of doing it surreptitiously, of doing it not with law as binding and self-evident and can be seen and declared to be the monstrous racism that it is. I would say that that slowly conquest that has been apparent in Israel is changing, and a far more deliberate, unapologetic, manifestly racist imposition of Israeli apartheid is being seen today with the recent emergence of an ultra-rightist, ultra-religious, ultra-nationalist, ultra-racist regime in the Netanyahu coalition. So I would say the South African pattern was not unique, but the way of legislating evidently and unapologetically for it did allow critics like myself to say this is obscene, this is immoral, this is illegal, this is unjust. And therein lay the strength of the anti-apartheid movement.
Before we get to the anti-apartheid movement, you do write about the close relationship between the South African government and the churches. And you say that the leaders of the white-led churches were complicit in the notion that the gospel not be politicized. Why, how did that come about, and what changed leading into the anti-apartheid movement, or as a result of the anti-apartheid movement?
Yeah, sure. I think the why and what changed question. In South Africa, there was a divide in the white community between those whom I have talked of as the perceived elected, the Boer Afrikaner people, and the liberal so-called whites like myself, who were English speaking and purported to be horrified at the terrible things that were taking place by fellow whites in dispossessing the black population. In effect, for most of us as English-speaking whites, we could have our cake and eat it. We enjoyed all the benefits of apartheid, but we declared our unhappiness that these benefits were derived, sadly, to the detriment of our black neighbors. But we did feathers about it. We enjoyed the spoils of apartheid, and because the English community was very much in the driving seat economically, the spoils of apartheid before BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, came along to ruin the party. But the economic benefits of apartheid were derived substantially by the English-speaking whites and not the evident perpetrators of apartheid. And so I began to have a decided love-hate relationship with my fellow English-speaking whites. And to come to the church aspect, there were two things that were determinative in causing the church to side with apartheid. The one was for the Boer church, the Afrikaner church, the belief in Calvinist election. And just as the government under Foster at one time as Prime Minister saw itself as a God-given government, so the Dutch Reformed Calvinist Church under his brother, Dominee or Pastor Foster, saw the church as God elected, and thus the two Fosters were the two leaders of the Afrikaner elected people, government and church, and that was a very powerful alliance. The English-speaking churches, like the Anglicans and the Methodists, of which I'm a member, and others of us, we opted out of taking sides. We were inclined to use this horrible phraseology: we seek solutions, not sides. But of course, along came an embarrassing big mouth black churchman called Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And Tutu said, "Man, you've got it wrong, you white church leaders. Silence before oppression is endorsing and siding with oppression. So open your mouth and denounce the apartheid that hurt, humiliates, and destroys us as black people." And so it was that we had, as white church people, to move away from the cop-out, the excuse that politics and apartheid don't mix in church circles. Church circles don't mix in politics. But of course, that's tantamount to saying, isn't it, that the gospel of the church has nothing to say about injustice. Well, God help us, let's close down the church. Let's close down religion. If the church and other religions have nothing to say about the kingdom of God and the kingdom of justice being evident in the socio-political structures which govern our society. And the Hebrew scriptures having talked about the racism that can be found there in the Amalekite demonization passages, those same beautiful Hebrew scriptures of the prophets eulogize the prophetic message, which speaks for justice, which speaks for the alien, which speaks for the stranger. There are passages in Isaiah and Ezekiel which I feast on, and which my Lord Jesus was fed on as a child, and it formed and fashioned his message, whereby we say that the alien, the indigenous one, is as important as we, the ethnic group, the tribal group, who are living beyond tribalism, because the true religious live beyond ethnicity.
You know, one interesting sidelight that you point out is that the Jewish settlers in South Africa essentially settled for white privilege.
Yeah.
Not wanting to rock the boat and perceiving the blacks as the greater enemy than the apartheiders. And I didn't realize this, but you also point out that the prosecutor of Mandela was Jewish, and that he received awards from the South African Zionist Federation, the Jewish Board of Deputies. And then after apartheid collapsed, the South African Jewish establishment began to embrace Jews like Helen Suzman, who had been involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. I just thought that was an interesting, you know, sidelight as to human nature.
Can I say two things there, Bob? Because
yeah, sure,
they follow exactly from what you say. I mean, there are two ways of looking at the Jewish population under apartheid in South Africa, bearing in mind that the Jewish population was essentially European, East European, Latvia, Lithuania, and Russia, and so on. The one way, and this Helen Suzman, a famed Jewish woman in parliament who fought for human rights, as few did in that white parliament, Helen Suzman says, and I think says very fairly, let's acknowledge that by and large, the white Jewish immigrant population sided with the apartheid structures, or were at least silent before the apartheid atrocity. And she went on to say, but in so doing, and this was perfectly fair, they were no different from other white tribes or communities in South Africa. And secondly, there was within that Jewish society a small but very significant group of Jewish whites who sided sacrificially with the liberation movement. And a Jewish rabbi, Chief Rabbi Mervis of the Orthodox community here in Britain, made a statement a while ago saying that to call Israel an apartheid society is to demean the people in South Africa who suffered under apartheid. Well, 3 of the Jewish leaders in the African National Congress, all of whom were white as well as Jewish, made the response to the rabbi's assertion by saying, please, apartheid prevails in Israel. A difference being that the manifestation of apartheid in Israel is apartheid plus. It is worse than the apartheid we experience as oppressed white with dispossessed black in South Africa. And Joe Slovo, Casserole, Ronnie, and Dennis Goldberg were three remarkable Jewish fighters for Black liberation, honored by Nelson Mandela. My final little input here is that my boss in the Christian Institute had been a dissident white. He was an Afrikaner. He had been a leader in the Afrikaner Broederbond secret society implementing apartheid. He had a huge conversion experience, dramatic change, and moved from being an Afrikaner leader of the Afrikaans Church of Apartheid to become the Christian Institute leader, of which I was the deputy leader, of a body that was for BDS, that was for Black consciousness, that was for Black liberation, that was for universal franchise, that was silent before anything save apartheid. And so there you have a dissident voice of whites being so important in the Afrikaner community. He was honored by Mandela with a state funeral with Beyers Naudé. And Naudé, together with Slovo, Casserole, Goldberg, Jewish leaders, were also, of course, honored by the liberation leaders. So it's a mixed picture, but it's significant how there were these remnants who gave a legitimacy to whites in terms of taking justice serious.
Okay, so you mentioned a conversion experience, and I want to take this opportunity to spend a couple of minutes with you, having you tell us, how you came to be so involved in the anti-apartheid movement, what it was like. Did you have your own conversion experience, or were you, or as a young kid and young teen, were you already leaning that way? And I know from your book that you were actually exiled or banned at one point, and so you came to Great Britain. But tell us a little bit about it and what it was like to sort of be a non-tribal dissenter in your own land.
Right. I thank you for suggesting that I was non-tribal, a dissenter. Of course, I was very tribal in my youth. Went to all-white school and all-white institutions. I do three quick anecdotal things, conversion moments. As perhaps a 11-year-old, apartheid just being introduced, I was on a bus, and my father was an utter gentleman. He had taught me that if a woman is on a bus and she's standing and you're sitting, you whippersnap 11-year-old, you stand up and give her your seat. Thanks, Dad. And so there was a woman holding a baby. I stood. I said to the woman, "Won't you sit down?" The woman shook her head and declined. The conductor of the bus, they had them in those days, shouted at me, "Sit down, son. She's a Kaffir." Kaffirs, the derogatory, hurtful name attributed to Black people. It means pagan. Majority of Black people were devoutly religious. The apartheid law, of course, introduced into buses and everywhere, required that she, as second class, stand while I sat. I asked my dad about that when I got home, putting it ironically as, why can't I be a gentleman like you say anymore? The second anecdotal thing was that together with my fiance, we used to, Sunday by Sunday, go into a territory, a suburb called District 6. And District 6 was an essentially mixed race for, as we would say in South Africa then, the colored area, brown area. And we engaged with the local population. One day, we discovered that the local population, the thousands and thousands of them who lived on the doorstep of urban Cape Town, were being forcibly removed. This was transfer of population. This was thousands of people suffering home demolition and enforced removal to an area far from the Cape Town Central District called the Cape Flats, which was a desolate, windswept, sand dunes vicinity. And so if suddenly the community with whom you are building relationships across racial divide is being forcibly removed before your very sight, you begin to ask deep questions. The final anecdotal moment I describe is when, working with the Christian Institute, as I've defined it, this ecumenical, that is interchurch, multiracial body, a rarity in South Africa, I arrived with Beyers Naudé, my boss. We traveled together to find that the security police were swarming over the building we occupied in the heart of Johannesburg, and the day culminated in Beyers and I, with others, being banned. Our black colleagues suffered more severely than banning. Some of them were incarcerated without trial. My understanding of banning gave me an insight in later life as to the nature of dispossession and oppression, not only in apartheid South Africa, but as, of course, it is replicated in apartheid Israel. For suddenly, I saw that my banning was done outside of the rule of law. It was done by security police and ministerial edict. It was done denying me a day in court. The banning was based on information given, of which I was never informed nor divulged, as to the names of those who had called me a communist terrorist. And I was denied legal access in any defense before a court. This was replicated, as I would come to discover, in apartheid Israel. And of course, the aspect for political prisoners who are Palestinian is more dire, I would suggest, than the predicament I found myself in, whereby for 13 years I would be persona non grata in my own country after I had gone into exile in Britain, and the right of return, and it was a right of return, would be denied me by the apartheid white regime. And so I came to view the absence of the rule of law in Israel. I came to view the absence of access to people and reality of censorship. And I came to view the iniquitously named right of return of the Israeli regime which is of course not a right of return. The indigenous Palestinian people have no right of return to the land to which they should return, but foreign people of Jewish ethnicity who had to discover Israel on a map have a right of return to that land to which they have never been. And so it was these insights arising out of practical experience that led me to see not only the horror of what I call again domination, dispossession, discrimination by one ethnic group of another ethnic group, done with violence, to see that apartheid reality as prevailing in Israel today.
I want to ask you,
Yeah.
Brian, I want to ask you like a personal question. What did you do with your feelings of revulsion about the great majority of your fellow nationals and tribesmen who you felt were not living up the ideals that they espoused or should have been espousing? How did you deal with those?
Yeah.
Because some of us are having the same difficulty.
Yes, I mean, some people bear the challenge. I won't call it a burden. It's for them to define the exact word, but bear the challenge of being, I suppose, self-loathing Jews. I suppose I had a challenge of being a self-loathing white. I was fortunate in this way that at that time in my society, to condemn the white policies of South Africa, the apartheid white policies, did not criminalize me, if you like, as being anti-white. Because even in my society then, we were not, as a white community, stupid enough to say that just because a white condemns fellow whites, he or she is racist. What has transpired in regard to Jewish society and the criticism of the Israeli state is that, as we know, to condemn the Israeli state today by virtue of that iniquitous International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition is to be anti-Semitic. Now, good heavens, in South Africa, I was declared a terrorist and a communist. I don't think I was a terrorist because I espouse and have always espoused nonviolence. I don't think I was a communist because I couldn't even find a decent book on Karl Marx to acquaint myself with Marxism in an adequate way. But what I could be called was somebody who was embarrassed, ashamed by the policies perpetrated by my fellow whites, deliberately or silently endorsed. And the situation for the critic of apartheid Israel today is more fraught and more difficult than was the criticism by a white dissident in my homeland, South Africa, all those years ago. But that doesn't diminish the need to sustain the struggle and to challenge the iniquitous IHRA definition and others.
Okay, so I want to ask you some questions about the anti-apartheid movement and how it developed and why it succeeded after only, I mean, from 1948 to 1994, less than 50 years. We're going on at least that long now in Israel. So I want to ask you, but basically, why you think, what the important elements were that accounted for its success. But I also want you to ask you about the fact that it had both violent and nonviolent elements to it. How, whether, and if so, how those elements were integrated or coordinated, and what the nature of the coalition that developed, the African National Congress, and why it was ultimately able to succeed.
Yeah.
Internally, I know ultimately there was finally a success in enlisting the international community to condemn it. But in terms of how it developed internally, what do you think the important elements were?
Yeah, I think, Bob and friends, that a very important element was that the World Council of Churches, and I'm speaking from the religious, in this instance, Christian dimension, that the World Council of Churches had a conference in Johannesburg, a place called Cottesloe, in the 60s, in which the international voice of the church challenged the national voice of pro-apartheid churches in a way that was crucial. When I talk about Beyers Naudé, my icon and dissident hero, having had a conversion, his conversion started in that moment, because suddenly he was being challenged with what we call the gospel, the good news of a beyond tribal Jesus, as to why he was of tribal identity to the detriment of other tribes who shared the territory. And he couldn't defend apartheid. And I find that very often the debate about Israel today is not a debate with those who defend the Israeli policy against criticism, but it is a question of the demonizing as anti-Semitic of those who dare to decry and challenge and refute Israeli apartheid. That was a beginning moment within the church, and the church was very powerful and significant in the South African society, both black and white. A second factor was the emergence in the church of black leadership. For as long as the church was dominated by a white voice, that white voice would be, in questioning terms, muted. And it needed the tutu to come forward and tell it like it is, to say with love, but with justice and forthrightness and condemnation of apartheid. In the name of God, this is evil, this must end, this must go. And the longer you whites shut up and do not declare that truth, the longer the church lives a lie. And so both white and black leadership came in church terms to do dialogue with an international church community who had seen the light long before we discerned it in our white South Africa. I'd say a further factor was that increasingly the boycott, divestment, and sanctions factor began to bite. It sounds stupid to say that the sports boycott of apartheid white South Africa was a factor. Come on, did we really as whites need to kick a rugby ball around the world? The answer is yes, we did. We really did need to have a sense of belonging because we were white and Western, weren't we? And all we wanted to do was share with our kith and kin, who hitherto had been very kith and kinny with us. But now suddenly they were boycotting us. And that hurt. It hurt our self-esteem. It hurt our self-image. And that was a factor. But then there was divestment. And when suddenly a leading bank like Barclays said, we will divest, we will move out of South Africa, it didn't do so because it had a dream, its board of directors, as to what constitutes morality for banks in South Africa. It moved out because suddenly it was to its detriment to be there. Bank accounts, not in white South Africa, but all over the world where Barclays prevailed, not least in Britain, were being closed, especially by student community. And the whole divestment or disinvestment issue became so significant that what hitherto had not been true became true. Hitherto, economic prosperity and apartheid coexisted in parallel. Now, suddenly, economic disadvantage was being the product of apartheid. And so these two things converged. We couldn't have apartheid and economic prosperity. We had to choose. And ultimately, we chose, and a referendum was held to allow the choice under an apartheid leader of relative progressiveness, de Klerk, to choose that we would seek economic prosperity rather than economic disaster, a run on our banks. And of course, there was a huge capital flight from South Africa, which concentrated the white mind. And the last thing, of course, was sanctions. When a world community, instead of criminalizing them, as is done in many Western states today, instead of criminalizing sanctions, the West decided, in common, of course, with Eastern allies of the liberation movements, that they would go for sanctions. British government was one of the last to do so. And that was because Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister, was in close terms with Botha, the die-hard South African apartheid president at the time. And so these BDS factors were significant. That leaves me, Bob and friends, mystified as to why I am constantly told by supporters of Israel in Western democracies that BDS is bad, is to be criminalized. And then when suddenly a state called Russia invades Ukraine, I am told that BDS is an imperative. BDS works. BDS must be implemented against Russia. Good heavens, Russia has occupied. Good heavens, Russia has annexed the Crimea. People who occupy, people who annex, they violate international law. Implement BDS, bracket, but not with Israel. Israel is exceptional. Israel is immune. Israel has immutability.
Well, Israel is a protectorate of the United States, so that's part of the reason. Bill Aldrich asks this question: one of the pillars of apartheid is the inhuman treatment of the oppressed population, and he points out that some of the recent apartheid reports found apartheid throughout Israel, Palestine, and some only found it in the occupied Palestinian territories. And he says because it didn't have examples of inhuman treatment of Palestinians within Israel, within the Green Line. Can you cite examples of inhuman treatment of Palestinians within the Green Line, which he says is the weakest link in his knowledge? And I guess that comes down to the question of whether you think, like B'Tselem, that Israel is an apartheid regime throughout the whole territory, or like some of the others, only in the occupied territories.
Yeah, sure. It was, I think, in 2010 that a friend sent an article I'd written to the Herbst newspaper, a newspaper in Israel, which is of progressive inclination. And Gideon Levy, a chief correspondent at the time and still is, ran it as a front page. And in the article, I had suggested reasons why Israel, in its policy towards the occupied Palestinian territories, its policy of occupation of the West Bank, of blockade of Gaza, of annexation of East Jerusalem, was emulating the policies of apartheid South Africa, and was given to apartheid South Africa's dispossession in illegal and violent and racist way. As you can imagine, there was a bit of a all hell break loose moment, but Levy survived and did, as I recall, offer a disclaimer that this apartheid designation was valid for the OPT, Occupied Palestinian Territories. But we, to be fair to him, I colluded with this, we did not dare suggest that there was anything of that aspect of apartheid in the state of Israel per se. Time moves on. For the Israeli leadership, time has moved on in a very disruptive and tragic way for Palestinian people, be they Arab Israelis in Israel, or be they Palestinian in the occupied Palestinian territory. Israel itself, is B'Tselem, the human rights body in Israel, is Human Rights Watch, is Amnesty International? Is each one of them right in pointing to an apartheid regime in many instances, not confined to the OPT, but embracing of not only Israel proper, but Palestinian refugees in the diaspora? Well, my answer to that is that when in about 5 years ago, the basic law was implemented of nation state, Israel became not de facto, but de jure and a Jewish state. And as such, Palestinian citizens in Israel were deemed in language and before the law in all of status second class. Now, second class was a favorite phrase in white South Africa. I could never catch a bus at a second class bus stop. I had to walk to the first class bus stop. And I happily used the first class stairs and elevators, etc., etc. At that time of the basic law being implemented, the Deputy Supreme Court President of Israel, commendably for Israeli policy at the time, a Palestinian, he had this to say about the basic state law. Salim Gibran, I quote him, said that ethnicity is the core of a democratic state. When equality is the core of democracy. When then a Jewish state is the required name for the state of Israel today, this is racist, this is bad, this is lacking equality, this is determining people to be second class, and this, and here he spoke as a judge, this is bad news for Israeli law. That Salim Gibran's statement became an acute embarrassment for the Israeli lobby groups in Britain, because he had been the pin-up boy, showing that you could be Palestinian and a Deputy Supreme Court judge. Apartheid, yeah, rubbish. But here he was declaring the significance in such prejudicial way of the basic nation state law. And so from that time onwards, there has been this deterioration in the situation for Palestinians. Pretense and pretext are not even required by the new Israeli government. We had pretext and pretension with talk about a peace process, with talk about a two-state solution. But since Kerry of United States declared that there was no political will to renege or renounce rather the settlement of Jews in occupied Palestine, and the peace process ended. Since then, we have seen that two-state solution isn't even on the agenda. Netanyahu can be elected and re-elected and re-elected on a political platform that says there will never be a Palestinian state. There will never be Palestinian state independence. There will never be a Jewish settler required to go home from what he calls Samaria and Judea back to Israel because they live in Israel. He says that Jerusalem is the eternal and the one and only capital of a Jewish state. He is backed by Ben Gvir of his cabinet and telling the Gazans to go, if not to hell, to Saudi Arabia, to Iraq and Iran. He is backed by Smotrich in his cabinet, who says there are no Palestinians. Good heavens, I think the word saying there are no Black South Africans. There are no Palestinians. There presumably never were Palestinians. Presumably Lord Balfour and Lord Shaftesbury of my British imperialist inherited history were lying when they said a land without people, for a people without land, concurred the estimate by Golda Meir, who was Prime Minister of Israel at the time. But these assaults on truth and on democracy are so vicious and growing that I am amazed when I hear defenders of the state of Israel's apartheid policy talk about democracy. Even the commendable thousands who are scared of the judicial process being hijacked by the executive and the government, they are protesting against a democracy which is a democracy for Jews, but not a democracy for Arab Israelis. So how do you have a democracy which is of ethnic exclusivity and still be for all? What I'm rambling on about or raving on about is this movement to a one nation state, which is the de facto reality we have to deal with. And when your American government and my British government welcomes Netanyahu because we share values, because we believe in a two-state solution, they are perpetrating a lie, but I don't know why, because they're intelligent people. And I could excuse Pompeo, a former Secretary of State, for perpetrating a lie, because he was a religious heretic, being that Christian Zionism was an imperative for Jesus to return, which could only happen if Israel became an established state. And then all the Jews would be zapped, either converted or suffer genocide. So I could understand Pompeo saying, but I can't understand our governments in those two places not saying that the one state issue is the reality and how we deal with that is the imperative.
So we're winding down towards the end, and I guess what I want to ask you is, you know, from your vantage point, and your 80 some odd years, what do you think is going to happen ultimately in Israel-Palestine? Are you an optimist? Are you a pessimist? Where do you you know, what lessons can you draw from the apartheid South Africa experience that leads you to be either optimistic or pessimistic in the other situation?
I suppose in my heart, I'm an optimist. I was gloriously wrong when in my middle age, I suggested that I would die before the day of apartheid's ending occurred. And I was proved wrong, thank God. And here we live in South Africa, post-apartheid society, with all its problems and challenges. In regard to my moving beyond hope, the hope in which I feel I have to be imprisoned, the hope which I'm not allowed to escape from, moving alongside that, not out of it, but in parallel, I'm a pessimist. I'm a pessimist because the realism in me, I think, suggests that the situation is getting worse. And how can, in the light of what we've said today, I see it other than getting worse still before some turning point might be reached? We've talked about the ills and ailments of the ultra-right government that now prevails in Israel. I haven't, talked about the ills and ailments that prevails in regard to the policies, autocratic, of Hamas, and the policies woefully inadequate and certainly undemocratic of the West Bank Palestinian Authority. We have a situation where I'm told the youth despair of customary political avenues and seek their own avenue. And if you are devoid of adequate leadership in political terms, and if you are marginalized by the international community, then perhaps violence, in your estimate, becomes the only rational alternative. And we've had one, we've had two, we could, I'm told, have a third intifada. What I do say is that in seeking to understand the growth of violence on both sides, but of course, in proportional terms, far, far more intense in Israeli violent terms than Palestinian. The disproportionality a while ago when I wrote the book was 23 Palestinian deaths to one Israeli death. And yes, one Israeli death is one too many. But the pro-violence, the initiating violence, the primary violence in understanding and analyzing Israel-Palestine today is the violence perpetrated by Israeli apartheid. That was the truth in South Africa. Yes, Mandela and his African National Congress. Yes, Sobukwe and his Pan-Africanist Congress. Yes, Steve Biko and his Black Consciousness Movement. All had degrees of commending armed struggle. They weren't pacifists. But Mandela famously in the dock said to the white presiding judge, don't ask us in the liberation movement to give up on violence when ours is secondary, responsive to your white primary initiating apartheid violence. And that is why when I was called a terrorist, I had to say, I'm a funny kind of terrorist. When I see the terror of the apartheid state as personified in the policies of an apartheid state, and I see the oppressed as responding with a counter violence, and doing so because they are left with no alternative.
Reverend Brian Brown, thank you very much for being here and favoring us with all that you said. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of us here who are listening to you. Thanks so much, and thanks to everybody who came and who listened. And we're going to take some of those lessons home with us, I hope. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.